In the winter of 1313, drizzle and fog enveloped the castle of St. Clair. The massive gray stone walls were damp and covered with moss, like an ancient creature sleeping in the cold mist. The carriage carrying the new concubine Isolde de Veron rolled across the wooden bridge over the moat. The sound of hooves echoed along the city walls, accompanied by the hoarse cawing of crows. The heavy iron gate opened, the creaking sound rang out, as if a warning that from here, she had entered a world with no way back. The young woman in the green velvet cloak stepped down from the carriage, her eyes wide open as she looked up at the cold stone walls, as if she were entering a giant prison. On her first night in the cold castle, she listened to the wind whistling through the corridors and the creaking of chains in the watchtower. A flickering candle cast her trembling shadow against the stone walls. The experienced maid Agnes whispered as she combed her hair, "My lady, the harem is a place where one smiles while holding a knife in one's hand. Whoever is loved is also the one who will be hated." Isolde was silent, her heart pounding. Outside, the winter wind howled. She walked to the small window and looked down at the mist-covered courtyard. A black crow sat silently on the wall, its eyes shining in the darkness. In that moment she understood, she was no longer the free Isolde of yesterday, but just a pawn in the game of power where darkness reigned. The first dawn at the Château de St. Clair was pale and cold. From the narrow window of her room, Isolde saw a leaden sky, the clouds drawn in bands like mourning scarves. Below, the courtyard was covered with mist, the guards changing shifts in silence. Their footsteps echoed on the stone, dry and unfamiliar. She had hardly slept the night before. Agnes's whispers kept ringing in her head. "Here, smiles can kill." In the morning, Agnes took her for a walk around the inner palace, where only women, guards, and a few eunuchs were allowed. The long, narrow corridors, low arches, and dim light from small windows gave the impression of walking inside the bosom of a giant sleeping beast. At the end of the corridor, Isolde heard a faint chuckle. Two young concubines were whispering something, and when they saw her, they bowed, but their cold eyes examined her from head to toe. Agnes tilted her head and said softly, "Don't let them see your fear. Here, the weak will be torn apart without a knife." Isolde nodded, her hands unconsciously tightening the edge of her robe. At noon, she was taken to the concubine's embroidery room. The light from a single window shone on the embroidery table and the bottles of dyed ink. No one said a word. Only the sound of the needle gently touching the canvas was heard, like the sound of an hourglass dropping grains one by one. An elderly concubine with a slender figure glanced at her and smiled faintly. "Welcome to the world of silence." That afternoon, as she walked through the inner palace garden, Isolde saw a moss-covered statue of an angel. At its feet, a few wilted roses from the previous season lay. Agnes leaned close to her ear. "My lady, this is where a poisoned bird was found. It was just a message, don't even dream of flying away from here." A shiver ran down her spine. At night, the castle became even more oppressive than during the day. The wind whistled through the cracks in the stone doors, the clanging of iron chains and the cawing of crows echoed from the walls. Isolde sat at a small wooden table, writing letters home, uncertain if they would ever reach their destination. Out in the hallway, she heard strange footsteps, then a very soft whisper, as if the wind were passing through the cracks in the walls. The next morning, Isolde attended breakfast in the inner palace for the first time. Queen Mother Matilda sat on a high chair, her cold eyes scanning the table. Each concubine bowed her head in silence, only the sound of knives and forks lightly touching silver plates could be heard. Matilda spoke slowly. "In the palace, those who keep their mouths shut will live long." The atmosphere was so heavy that Isolde felt like the entire castle was listening to her breathing. That afternoon, Agnes led her to the north watchtower. From here, she could look down on the entire courtyard. The cold wind blew hard, and the watchtower shook from time to time. Agnes pointed down. "Look, my lady. Every person in that courtyard could be someone's eyes and ears." Isolde looked down. Soldiers, maids, even the cooks, everyone's eyes were as cold as ice. That night, she sat alone by the window, the pale moonlight shining on her face. The distant caw of crows was a reminder that the silence of the castle was but a cover for countless secrets. And then, the first words that she would never forget rang out in her mind. The harem is a place where whispers kill faster than swords. It was on the third day in the harem that Isolde truly felt the chill of isolation. In the morning, she was summoned to the mirror room, a special room with frosted bronze mirrors hanging on the walls. Here, concubines were taught how to walk, bow, and smile to please the Queen Mother. The instructor was the high concubine Beatrix, a thin woman in her 40s with sharp eyes. She stood behind Isolde, correcting every tilt of her head and the curve of her wrist. "In the palace, even your shadow must be obedient," she whispered, her voice sliding down her neck like a knife. Isolde looked into the mirror and saw her own reflection tremble for a moment. That evening, when she returned to her room, she found a small piece of paper tucked under the door. The ink was smudged with moisture. "The one who is seen the most will die first." Isolde's hands trembled as she quickly lit the piece of paper on the candle, watching the ashes float and disappear. In her heart, fear transformed into a new awareness. She was entering a game of life and death, where the loser would not have a second chance. That night, the sounds of wind and crows mingled again. Somewhere in the castle, there was a soft laugh, or was it just the wind howling through the cracks in the walls? She could not be sure. Isolde sat close to the window, hugging her cloak tightly. The castle was like a giant stone dragon, swallowing all her warmth and even her sleep. The 7th day after Isolde arrived in St. Clair, the winter feast was held. It was a rare occasion for the harem and court to appear together in the Great Hall, to celebrate the harvest and new political alliances. The maids had been bustling about since early morning. Agnes helped Isolde change into a deep red velvet dress, hand-stitched with gold thread and studded with small stones. "Red is the color of power," Agnes said softly, "and also the color of blood. Remember that when you enter the Great Hall." Isolde looked at herself in the frosted bronze mirror. Her eyes were a mixture of fear and determination. The Grand Palais St. Clair was ablaze that night with hundreds of candles and huge iron chandeliers hanging from the high vaulted ceiling. Tapestries of lions and falcons covered the stone walls, but a chill still rose from the floor. As Isolde entered, all eyes followed her. Some curious, some contemptuous, and a few as sharp as knives. She felt as if she were walking into a pack of wolves waiting for their next prey. The king sat on a high throne, next to Queen Mother Matilda with a small crown studded with green jade. In the lower seats were the other concubines, divided into small groups, laughing and whispering, but none of their eyes were harmless. Isolde was arranged to sit near the end of the long table, opposite a concubine named Clarisse, famous for her sharpness and malice. Clarisse took a sip of wine, her red lips curled up. "Well, the new flower of the palace. I hope you know how to bloom without being withered by the winter wind." Isolde smiled faintly, remembering Agnes's words. Here, the sweetest words often contain the most poison. Music was playing, lutes and flutes. The servants brought in plates of roast meat, black bread, and red wine. The atmosphere was warm, but Isolde still felt like she was sitting among predators. In the middle of the feast, a low scream rang out from the end of the table. A young court lady collapsed, her hands still clutching her wineglass. The wine spilled onto the table, red as blood. The whole hall fell silent. The queen frowned slightly, then signaled for the soldiers to drag the girl's body away without a word of explanation. No one dared to ask. Isolde looked at her wineglass, her throat dry. Clarisse leaned in and whispered, her voice like a knife in her ear. "Don't worry. Here, death by wine is a merciful death." Isolde shuddered. In that moment, she understood that the party was not just a celebration, but a warning. That night, back in her room, Isolde could not sleep. The image of the fallen maid still haunted her mind. Agnes sat beside her, her voice low. "Don't ask. Here, those who know too much will die early. Learn to live with silence and eyes." Outside, the wind howled through the walls. The castle was once again plunged into darkness, with only the sound of chains and crows echoing in the distance. The next morning, rumors spread throughout the harem. The maid had been poisoned because she overheard something she shouldn't have. No one said who was behind it, but everyone understood that it was a message. As she strolled through the courtyard, Isolde felt as if every wall, every window, every eye was watching her. Fear became her new companion. That night, she found a mysterious embroidered handkerchief on her bed. When she opened it, there was a black raven feather inside. Isolde trembled. Agnes whispered, "Someone is sending a message, you are being targeted." Isolde felt as if the entire castle was a living prison, where every breath could be a trap. But there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. "If they want to take me down, I must learn to survive first." On the last night of the first week, Isolde stood on the high gallery overlooking the courtyard. The moonlight illuminated the red wine stains left on the banquet table, reminding her that the blood of the harem flowed in silence. And as she turned back inside, a whisper came from the darkness, "Welcome to the game of survivors." Isolde understood now. The feast was not a welcome, but a warning. And every smile in the harem was a knife. After the winter feast, Isolde was no longer invisible in the harem. Every step she took on the stone corridor rang like a warning bell, causing the narrow doors to open slightly and invisible eyes to follow. Agnes whispered as she walked and adjusted her cloak. In the palace, not everyone needs swords and spears. A look is a weapon enough to kill from within. At noon, Isolde was invited into Queen Matilda's study. The room was large, with a high ceiling, the walls covered with wooden shelves and Bibles. The smell of beeswax and old paper hung in the air. The Queen Mother sat by the narrow window, the light falling on her face as cold as a statue. "You must learn to look without looking. To see without seeing. That way you will survive." Isolde bowed her head, both afraid and aware. She was not joking. That afternoon, as she walked through the hallway near the kitchen, Isolde heard whispering. She stopped, her heart pounding. In the dark corner, two maids were exchanging a small bag. One was startled to see her, bowed her head and hurried away. The other smiled ambiguously. Agnes appeared behind her, pulling her hand. "Don't ask. What you don't see won't kill you." That night, Isolde received an invitation to tea from Clarisse. The tea table was in a small room with a round window overlooking the courtyard. Clarisse wore a green dress, her smile gentle but her eyes were like a knife. "I heard that the Queen Mother has taken notice of you." "How gratifying," Clarisse said, pouring tea and staring at her. Isolde held the cup, hesitantly. The steam rose, fragrant with herbs, but hidden within it was a feeling of chill down her spine. Agnes stood behind her and shook her head slightly. Isolde deftly put the cup down. "I beg your pardon for not drinking. I'm still not used to the taste of tea here." A flash of anger flashed in Clarisse's eyes. Later that night, another maid drank the rest of the tea. The next morning, she suddenly fell ill. The rumor spread like wildfire. "There's poison in the tea." Clarisse was still smiling as if nothing had happened, but Isolde knew she had just escaped the first trap. In the days that followed, Isolde noticed a sophisticated network of surveillance that covered the harem. Maids and eunuchs passed messages through their eyes and small objects. Every open door and dark corner could hide an eavesdropper. Every step, every glance, every whisper was recorded somewhere. Once, as she walked across the courtyard, she saw a figure on a watchtower, not a guard, but someone watching her. At night, Agnes whispered, "Madam, I heard today that your name appeared on the whisper list. That means you are being watched." Isolde understood that she was no longer an outsider. Every step from now on would be in the net of power. Late at night, she tried to write a letter home, but then tore it up. This stone wall swallowed up all secrets, and sometimes even paper and ink betrayed its owner. Isolde sat looking out the window at the moonlight, thinking to herself, "If I want to survive, I must learn to play with them, or be as silent as the night." The next day, Isolde overheard a conversation between two other concubines. "The Queen Mother won't let this go. This new girl will have to choose sides. Or she will become Clarisse's last pastime." Isolde stood behind the door, her heart pounding, knowing that she had stepped into a game from which there was no turning back. On the last night of that week, Isolde looked out into the empty courtyard. A cold wind blew, carrying the distant caw of crows. A silent vow echoed in her heart. If I want to survive, I must become someone the darkness itself cannot swallow. Isolde had now officially entered the net of power, where her every move was seen, her every breath was valuable. That night, the moon was obscured by thick clouds, making the St. Clair castle look like a giant black stone that swallowed all the light. The wind whistled through the cracks in the door, carrying moisture and the distant cries of night birds. Isolde sat by the narrow window, feeling that tonight was longer than any other night. From afar, the clanking of iron chains on the watchtower sounded like the castle's eerie laughter. Agnes brought in a small oil lamp and said softly, "A moonless night is usually the night when the castle's demons wake up." Isolde shivered but did not reply. Since the bloody feast and the poisoned tea, she had learned that silence was more precious than words. Out in the hallway, strange footsteps sounded, slow, drawn out, as if they were meant to be heard. Around midnight, as Isolde was drifting off to sleep, a soft noise came from the wooden door. She opened her eyes, the oil lamp flickering, casting distorted shapes on the wall. The door moved a little, then stopped. Isolde held her breath, her hand unconsciously grasping the small dagger Agnes had secretly given her the day before. Suddenly, a long black object slithered through the crack in the door. It was a snake. Isolde choked. The snake slithered slowly across the stone floor, its tongue clicking in the absolute silence. She backed up onto the bed, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo throughout the room. Agnes rushed in at the sound, threw a thick blanket over the snake, then pushed it into a corner and hit it hard with a broom handle. The animal writhed for a moment, then lay still. Isolde trembled, looking at Agnes. Who did this?" Agnes said sternly. "In the harem, that question is more dangerous than the snake." The next morning, when the patrols came, they found muddy footprints in the hallway leading to Isolde's room, then they disappeared. No one was arrested. No one confessed. But the rumors spread quickly. Someone wanted her dead on a moonless night. Clarisse walked down the hallway, smiling as if she knew nothing, but her eyes flashed with cruel amusement. Isolde understood. The game had now become a hunt. Isolde sat in the room, watching the dead snake being placed in the wooden box, a cold feeling spreading from her palm to her heart. Agnes whispered, "Madam, if they fail once, they will try again." That night, Isolde did not sleep. She sat at her wooden table, writing her first diary entry. "They want me dead, but I will live. And when I survive, I will remember every face, every eye in this darkness." The crows cawed in the distance. The wind shook the oil lamp, casting light on her face, no longer just fear, but a seed of determination. The next day, as she walked through the enclosed garden, Isolde raised her head to look at Clarisse for the first time without avoiding her gaze. Clarisse raised her eyebrows as if surprised that the prey now knew how to look the hunter straight in the eye. The next night, Isolde stood on the watchtower, looking out over the castle in the mist. Fear and determination mingled inside her, as if she had just become part of this cruel game of survival. She whispered to herself, "If darkness is the rule of the game, I will learn to walk like darkness." And from that moment on, Isolde was no longer the trembling prey, but the first survivor in a game that lasted longer than the moonless night. The moonless night not only robbed Isolde of sleep, but also awakened her survival instinct. In the harem of St. Clair, fear did not disappear, it only became strength for those who knew how to survive. In the morning, Isolde stepped out into the long corridor covered with red velvet. The weak winter sunlight shone through the narrow windows, creating long sword-like streaks of light on the stone floor. The rustling of silk skirts echoed in the silence, making her feel as if every step was being watched. In the distance, Clarisse and 2 other concubines were approaching. They smiled charmingly, but their eyes were like wolves that had just smelled blood. Clarisse stopped and lightly touched Isolde's hand. "You look so pretty today. The turquoise color suits you." Her voice was sweet, but the compliment was like a tight rope. Agnes stood behind her, tilting her head slightly as if to remind Isolde not to reveal any flaws. She smiled and replied softly. Thank you. Your compliments are precious. Clarisse curled her lips slightly, then left, leaving behind a faint scent of roses but as cold as steel. In the afternoon, Queen Matilda held a tea party in the private garden. The concubines sat around a round stone table, on which were shiny silver vases, plates of winter fruit, and dried flowers. The air was so quiet that the sound of the wind blowing through the bare trees could be heard clearly. Every word was gentle, but behind it was a dagger of words. Clarisse lifted her teacup and smiled. Lady Isolde, what do you think of this palace? Isolde bowed her head slightly. Beautiful, but also very cold. The answer made several concubines look at each other, their eyes flashing with malicious delight. Another concubine, Celine, leaned in and said, It is right to be cold, for every corner has its own shadow. Isolde understood that every word was a test, a psychological game to measure the weakness of her prey. That evening, the harem held a small ball, called a masked night, but in reality a coming-out party for the factions. The concubines wore thin silk masks, each approaching the other with a smile but no one trusting anyone. Isolde wore a jade-green dress and a silver mask, walking amid the scrutiny of the eyes. She saw Clarisse dancing with a young official, his eyes glancing at her as if marking his territory. Suddenly, a concubine tripped, the glass of red wine in her hand fell, and the wine splashed onto Isolde's dress. Everyone was silent for a heartbeat, then burst out laughing, but all eyes were on her. Agnes stepped forward to wipe the wine off her, whispering, This is a message. They want to remind you that blood can always get on your silk dress. After the party, Isolde realized that she had become bait to test the reactions of the wolf pack. Clarisse led a group of concubines, Celine and a few others followed. They were the attackers. The rest were silent, following the Queen Mother, just watching and taking notes. Agnes said softly as they returned to their rooms, My lady, the game has truly begun. Tonight they are toying with you, tomorrow it could be real knives. That night, Isolde no longer trembled as before. She sat by the window, looking at the pale moonlight and saying to herself, If they are wolves, I will learn to walk like a wolf. In the mirror she saw her eyes no longer those of prey, but of a survivor. The next morning she stepped out into the courtyard. Clarisse saw her and smiled, but Isolde smiled back for the first time, a smile so cold that it made her pause for a moment. From that moment on, the hunt had changed roles. At night, Isolde walked the corridors without avoiding anyone's eyes. The guards, the maids, and even the eavesdroppers in the dark all sensed the change. She had learned her lesson. In the harem, only those who walked like wolves survived. Isolde was no longer the trembling flower of the first day. In the mirror she whispered, To survive, I will learn to smile like them. And when the time comes, I will bite back. The harem was no longer a shelter, but a forest full of wolves in silk clothes. Isolde had stepped one foot into a real survival game, where every smile was a trap. That winter, the Château de Saint Clair received bad news from the frontier. The enemy was gathering in the north, while the king was increasingly indulged in banquets. Isolde stood on the high veranda, looking down at the deserted courtyard. Snow covered the roof tiles, and the royal flag fluttered weakly in the wind. She heard her maid whisper, When war comes, the throne will tremble like a candle in the wind. While there was war outside, another danger lurked within the palace. Queen Mother Matilda summoned the concubines to a closed meeting room. She sat on a high wooden chair, her eyes as sharp as knives. The king is being careless. You all, remember that whoever shows weakness will die before hearing the sound of the war drums. Isolde bowed her head, clearly feeling the fear filling the room. That afternoon, as she passed the old armory, Isolde overheard the whispers of two chamberlains. Clarisse has bribed the northern guards. What does she want? If the king goes to war and dies, the harem will choose the one who will rule the throne. Isolde's heart raced. For the first time, she realized that the harem game was not just about killing in the dark, it could also shake the throne. At night, Clarisse held a private party in the harem, inviting only her close concubines. Agnes advised Isolde, Don't go. The wind smells of blood tonight. But Clarice's invitation could not be refused. Isolde entered the candlelit room, the red curtains swaying gently in the wind. Every gaze seemed to weigh her life. Clarice poured the wine, smiling sweetly. "Drink, to deepen our sisterhood." Isolde held the glass. The smell of the wine was as heavy as iron, the red light reflected on her face. For a moment, she remembered the red wine on the winter banquet table, and gently put the glass down. The whole room fell silent for a breath. 2 days later, the news came: the border had fallen. The king turned pale in the palace, and Queen Mother Matilda was furious, throwing the golden cup to the floor. The concubines stood still, only to hear the sound of the shattering. Isolde felt the whole castle tremble with the anger of the most powerful mother in the kingdom. That night, the storm blew around the walls. Isolde stood by the window, listening to the crows and the distant trumpets. Agnes's words echoed in her mind. When the throne is shaken, the first to be swallowed are always the weak. She knew that if she did not become a part of the game of power, sooner or later she would be an anonymous corpse within this stone wall. The next morning, Isolde went to the mirror room. She looked at herself in the frosted bronze mirror, smiling slightly, but her eyes were different, no longer the prey, but someone who would learn to live among the wolves. Agnes stood behind her, nodding. Good. Only those eyes can survive in this palace. That evening, she walked down the long corridor bathed in the evening light. The guards, the maids, and even those listening in the darkness sensed a change. A survivor was awakening. On the last night of that tumultuous week, Isolde stood on the watchtower, watching the royal banner tremble in the wind. She whispered softly, "If the throne totters, I will not let myself fall with it." The throne tottered not only because of war, but also because of the darkness in the harem. And in that darkness, Isolde began to learn to stand firm as part of the power. That night, drizzle and fog covered the castle of St. Clair. Isolde sat in her room, listening to the wind howling through the stone walls and the crows flapping on the wet tiles. Agnes was cleaning the oil lamp when a piercing scream rang out from the west side of the castle. She rushed out into the hallway, where black smoke was beginning to rise from the storeroom. The alarm bells blared loudly, mixed with the sound of guards running. Isolde and the other concubines ran out into the courtyard. Flames had burst from the food storehouse, lighting up the gray sky. In the firelight, figures ran in panic, and the cawing of crows echoed eerily. Queen Mother Matilda appeared, her face cold as steel, her voice echoing over the sound of the fire. "Who dares to light a fire in my night?" The concubines bowed their heads, trembling, no one dared to answer. In that moment, Isolde understood that this fire was not an accident, but the beginning of a bloody game. When the guards put out the fire, a maid's body was found by the door of the warehouse. Her body was charred, her hand still clutching a black iron key. Clarice stepped forward to look, smiling faintly. How pitiful! But who can say she didn't bring this on herself? Isolde was silent, feeling as if the fire was devouring all the trust in the castle. That night, before the smoke had cleared, a rumor spread quickly. The storehouse has been destroyed. Someone wants the court to starve before war comes to the door. Isolde understood that the throne was shaking not only because of the enemy outside, but because of the darkness within the palace. Agnes squeezed her hand and said softly, "Remember, my lady, it is not the innocent who survive, it is the one who chooses sides." 3 days after the fire, a banquet was held in the harem to commemorate the dead ladies in waiting. The queen mother sat on a high chair. The concubines wore pale gray mourning robes, but their eyes were as bright as predators. As she bowed, Isolde felt a gaze from the corner of the room piercing her neck. When she looked up, Clarice was smiling, the smile of someone who had just thrown an invisible blade. That night, Isolde returned to her room to find a half-burnt piece of cloth and a raven feather on her bed. The message was clear: the night of fire is over, but your turn is coming. She sat still in the darkness, listening to the wind whistling and the distant calls of crows. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air in the castle was still thick with smoke and fear. Isolde realized, "I will not wait for them to kill. I will learn to light my own fire, a smokeless fire that kills silently. Her eyes in the bronze mirror lit up like the first spark in the darkness. The next morning, as she walked through the courtyard, Isolde no longer avoided anyone's gaze. The palace maids, the guards, and even those listening in the dark all noticed the change. A survivor had emerged from the flames. That last night of the week, she stood on the watchtower, looking down at the blackened burn marks that still marked the stone courtyard. The night wind blew hard, carrying the faint scent of smoke, and Isolde whispered, "My fire will not shine in their eyes, but it will burn all who dare come near." The fire of the night took one life, but lit a new survivor. Isolde stepped out of the darkness with her eyes watching and her hand ready to wield power in silence. After the night of fire, Isolde understood that silence was no longer enough. If she continued to stand outside, sooner or later she would become ashes in a game where the strong wrote the rules. In the morning, she walked through the cold, damp corridor and saw Celine, the concubine who was quiet, known as the shadow of the Queen Mother. Isolde nodded slightly. Celine responded with a quick glance, saying nothing but her eyes flashing with recognition. That night, Agnes said softly as she closed the door, "Madam, if we want to live, we must learn to rely on the darkness to walk." Isolde sat down, drew a small diagram with charcoal on the wooden table, marking the concubines who could be trusted and those who were dangerous. The game of survival officially began from here. 3 days later, at the new moon, Isolde crept out into the hidden garden. There, Celine waited, her gray cloak blending into the shadows. "What do you want?" Celine asked. "A reason to live and an ally." The short answer made Celine smile for the first time. Celine handed her a small piece of cloth embroidered with the symbol of the Queen Mother's faction. "From now on, we have the same enemy. But remember, loyalty in the palace is only as long as a breath." Isolde nodded, knowing that the secret pact had been formed without the need for paper or ink. That night, when she returned to her room, Isolde had a distinct feeling that someone was watching her. She walked down the long hallway, the torchlight casting long shadows on the walls. For a moment, a pair of eyes flashed through the narrow opening, then disappeared. Agnes whispered, "The darkness in this castle never closes its eyes to sleep." A few days later, Isolde and Celine tried their hand at their first game. They spread a false rumor that Clarisse had a secret lover in the palace. In just one night, the rumor spread like wildfire throughout the harem. Clarisse appeared at breakfast the next morning, her face stiff, her eyes filled with anger but unable to openly refute it. Isolde kept her face calm, knowing in her heart that the chessboard had begun to shift. That night, Celine sent a red thread to Isolde's room, a sign of her first victory. But she also knew that this small victory would invite a greater storm. Isolde began to practice walking without making a sound, listening to the wind, the dripping water, and the whispers in the dark corners. She learned that in this castle, survival belonged to those who listened more than they spoke. One night, she overheard Clarisse plotting with a eunuch. "If the new girl doesn't disappear soon, I'll take care of it myself." At the end of the chapter, Isolde sat by the window watching the full moon rise over the city walls. In her heart, she was no longer the trembling prey, but the active player of the harem chessboard. She whispered to herself, "The pact has been made, the chessboard has been opened. From now on, I will not wait to die anymore." The night wind blew, carrying the distant caw of crows. An alliance in the darkness had formed, and from that moment on, Isolde was no longer alone in this game of life and death. Isolde has entered the real power game. She has her first ally. She knows how to influence in the shadows. And she is no longer a passive player in the game of life and death. The dawn was different that day. The fog was thick, the sky a foreboding gray. Isolde stepped out into the courtyard, the cold biting her skin, and heard the guards whispering. "They found a body in the east wing. There's blood all the way up the steps." Isolde's heart clenched. She knew the game had turned into a real bloodbath. A moment later, the trumpet sounded. The concubines were summoned to the inner courtyard, where the guards dragged out a body. It was Celine, Isolde's first ally. Her throat was slashed deeply, blood already drying on her gray dress. Isolde was cold all over, but she did not allow herself to tremble. In this harem, showing fear was signing one's own death warrant. Queen Matilda appeared, without a word. She looked down at Celine's body, then looked up, her eyes like knives scanning the concubines. Last night, blood was shed. The perpetrator dies 10 times slower than the victim. Clarice stood by, smiled briefly, then bowed deeply. Isolde saw that smile, and knew that the hand behind the blood was not far from her. In the afternoon, in her private room, Agnes's voice trembled. "Madam, she is our only ally." Isolde clenched her fists. "No, from today on, I will not seek allies, I will become the hunter myself." In her heart, fear had turned into a cold fire, burning without smoke but burning away the last of her innocence. That night, Isolde did not sleep. She stood on the high corridor, looking down at the mist-shrouded courtyard. The pale moonlight shone on the bloodstains still on the steps, reminding her that this harem had tasted real blood. In the darkness, she heard slow footsteps and the faint clanging of metal, increased guard, but also an opportunity for the predator to hide. At dawn, Clarice appeared in front of her room, carrying a basket of white flowers. "It's a pity for Celine. But in this harem, flowers that wither must make way for new ones to bloom." Isolde smiled faintly, looking at the basket of flowers as if it were a trap. The most beautiful flowers are those that grow on soil that has drunk blood. Clarice paused for a moment, then smiled, her eyes as sharp as a knife. That afternoon, Isolde took a walk in the eastern block where Celine had been murdered. The space was damp and cold. The smell of blood had faded but the feeling of death still lingered. Suddenly, she heard strange footsteps behind her. A figure appeared, holding a dagger. Isolde backed away towards the stone wall, her heart pounding. But the figure only passed by, throwing a black scarf behind her, a reminder, "You are next." Isolde picked up the handkerchief, no longer trembling. In her heart, the fear had turned to cold calculation. If blood has been spilled, then the next turn will not be mine. That night, she wrote her first diary entry in red ink. "I have crossed the line of fear. From today on, I will choose for myself who will be the next to shed blood." The night wind blew the oil lamp, and Isolde's shadow on the wall looked long and sharp like a sword blade. At the end of the chapter, Isolde stands on the watchtower, looking down on the castle, covered in mist and blood. Celine is dead, and the game has no way out for anyone. She whispers softly, "This harem has just drunk its first blood, and it will never stop." The first blood has been spilled, and Isolde has stepped into the role of true survivor. The game of power is no longer a metaphor, it is life against life. At the end of the chapter, Isolde stands on the watchtower, looking down on the castle, covered in mist and blood. Celine is dead, and the game has no way out for anyone. She whispers softly, "This harem has just drunk its first blood, and it will never stop." The first blood has been spilled, and Isolde has stepped into the role of true survivor. The game of power is no longer a metaphor, it is life against life. Isolde entered, wearing a silvery black dress, the color of night and survival. Clarice wore a crimson red, smiling as if victory was in her grasp. Their eyes met, no longer hiding their hatred. The music played, but no one was really happy. The red wine glasses rippled like blood, the cakes smelled of honey but tasted bitter in the throat. The Queen Mother sat on a high chair, her eyes watching every little movement. Every time someone raised a glass, Isolde would turn her wrist slightly to check the reflection in the wine, as if every glass could contain death. Clarice stood up and raised her glass. "Tonight, the flowers in the harem will bloom the most brilliantly." The laughter rang out, but it was cold and hollow. In that moment, Isolde realized that everyone was like predators circling each other, waiting for someone to make a mistake so they could pounce and bite. As the party entered the middle of the night, a scream tore through the music. A concubine collapsed onto the table, blood pouring from her mouth. Chaos erupted immediately. Isolde stood still, her eyes calmly observing, as if she had been waiting for this moment. For a moment, she saw Clarice standing still, then turning to glare at her, as if seeing her own fate. The Queen Mother stood up, her voice colder than steel. "Tonight, the flowers have withered. From now on, there will only be room in the palace for those who know how to survive." The guards rushed in, dragging Clarice away with a weak protest. Her eyes were red, filled with hatred, but there was no chance to counterattack. After the purge, the bright night of celebration turned into a silent night of mourning. Isolde stepped out into the courtyard. The sky was just beginning to brighten, the mist mixed with the remaining candle smoke. The crows cawed loudly, like a farewell to all the withered flowers. She stood alone, taking a deep breath. In her heart, the fear had died, leaving only the emptiness and serenity of the survivor. The Queen Mother stepped out and stood beside her. "Do you understand the game?" "Yes. And from now on, I will never forget." She smiled coldly, then turned away, leaving Isolde standing in the mist, officially taking on the role of the last survivor of the St. Clair harem. The final night of the festival brought an end to the power play that had lasted all winter. Isolde looked up at the pale gray sky, feeling as if the castle had swallowed her very soul. But she was still alive, and in this harem, survival was the only victory. Isolde entered her room, the stone door closing softly. In the bronze mirror, she saw the face of a man no longer a victim, but one who had gone his own way. The harem of St. Clair closed a winter of blood and ashes. The silk flowers had withered, and only Isolde remained, the last survivor, stepping out of the darkness with a hardened soul and the eyes of one who had looked death straight in the eye.